I was 24 years old, one semester away from finishing my nursing degree, when my own family looked me in the eye and told me my education was over. Not because we'd run out of money. Not because of some sudden emergency. Because I wouldn't say sorry to my brother for something I never actually did. And if you've ever sat at a table and realized the people who were supposed to protect you were about to use your future as a bargaining chip, you already know how the rest of this story feels, before I even say another word. My name is Nora Ellison, and that Thursday started like every other Thursday, at my parents' house. My mother had made her chicken and dumplings, the recipe she only pulled out when she wanted the whole house to smell like everything was fine. My father sat at the head of the table, slicing his food with this slow, ceremonial patience he always used right before he said something he'd clearly practiced in his head all day. My brother Grant, 27, sat directly across from me, jaw tight, eyes glued to his plate. He hadn't really looked at me in almost a month, not since something had happened at his job that had somehow, through the retelling, become entirely my fault. Here's what actually happened. A few weeks earlier, Grant had been passed over for a management position at the marketing firm where he worked. At a cookout, not long before that, his coworker Derek had asked me, casually, what Grant was like growing up. I'd answered honestly, said he'd always struggled with taking feedback, that it was just how he was wired. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. But somewhere between that cookout and this dinner, my one offhand comment had transformed, in Grant's mind, and then in my parents' minds, into the reason his career had stalled. For weeks, the house had felt like weather right before a storm, quiet, heavy, waiting to break. So, when my father set his fork down and folded his hands that night, I knew something was coming. I just had no idea how far it would actually reach into my life. He said it without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. He said that as long as I lived under his roof and let him help pay for school, I represented this family, and representatives of this family didn't go around undercutting their siblings to outsiders. He said Grant deserved a real apology, not the stiff, half-hearted one I'd already given. And he said that if I couldn't manage that, they'd be putting my tuition payments on hold until I understood the weight of what I'd supposedly done. My mother didn't say a single word. She just kept her gaze on her plate and reached over to refill Grant's glass, and that tiny gesture told me everything about where she actually stood. I sat there and felt something move inside my chest. Not rage, exactly, something quieter and colder than rage. Something that felt like a door swinging shut on its own. I'd spent 24 years watching my parents orbit around my brother, like he was the only sun in our solar system. Every recital, where his applause somehow drowned out mine. Every holiday, planned around what he wanted. Every disagreement, where his version of the story simply became the official one. I'd swallowed all of it for years, because I loved my family, and because I'd convinced myself that love just meant constantly making yourself smaller. But sitting there that night, hearing that my degree, my clinical hours, my 2 years of 5 a.m. study sessions before 12-hour shifts, could be held hostage, until I bowed to a man who'd never once been held responsible for anything in his life. That was the moment my capacity to shrink myself finally ran out. I looked at my father. I looked at my brother. And I said one word. Fine. Not, fine, I'll apologize. Not, fine, you've made your point. Just, fine, like a door closing at the end of a very long hallway. My father nodded, like he'd just won an argument. My mother let out a breath, like a woman who'd successfully avoided a scene. And Grant, for one brief second, finally lifted his eyes to mine, and I held that look just long enough, before I pushed my chair back, folded my napkin, and walked upstairs, without another word. I didn't sleep that night. By 10 o'clock, I'd dragged 2 suitcases down from my closet shelf. By midnight, they were both full of scrubs, textbooks, chargers, the small cedar box where I kept my savings bonds, and my late grandmother's sewing thimble, the one thing of hers I'd been given. My friend Priya had been telling me for months that her guest room was mine whenever I needed it. I texted her at 1:12 in the morning. She answered in under 3 minutes, "Keys under the flower pot, come whenever." By 4 a.m., my car was packed. I sat behind the wheel, in the dark driveway, and looked back at the house I'd grown up in, the porch light my mom left on every single night, the basketball hoop Grant had begged for at 13, and used maybe 5 times, the hydrangeas my grandmother had planted along the walkway, years before she passed. I braced myself for some wave of grief. It never came. What I felt instead was clarity, sharp and almost frightening in how calm it was. I drove to Priya's. I slept maybe 3 hours. Then I got up, made coffee, and started digging through emergency grant and scholarship options for my last semester. There were more than I expected. I also still had my part-time job at an urgent care clinic, the one my parents never fully approved of, always saying, "We take care of you, why do you need to work?" That job ended up being the thing that kept me upright. My phone started buzzing around 8 that morning. My mother first, then my father. I let both calls go to voicemail and kept typing. What I wasn't prepared for was the message that came through at 8:51 from Grant. 4 words, no explanation, no context, "Please, tell me you didn't." I stared at that text for a long moment, before my phone rang again. This time it was my father, and his voice had lost every ounce of the calm authority it always carried at that dinner table. He sounded like someone who'd walked into a familiar room and found all the furniture gone. He asked what I had sent. What exactly had I sent, to who? And that's when it hit me, whatever Grant thought I'd done. I hadn't done anything at all. I want to be clear about this part, because it matters. I hadn't made a single call. I hadn't emailed anyone at his company, hadn't messaged a single coworker. I had packed my bags and left, quietly, while everyone else was asleep. Whatever guilt was making my brother's hands shake enough to send that message before 9 in the morning had nothing to do with me. It had been sitting inside him this whole time. When my father asked what I'd sent, I told him the truth, nothing. I told him I'd packed up my room, loaded my car, and left in the middle of the night. I told him I was safe, staying with a friend, and that I'd reach out when I was ready. He went quiet, in a way that wasn't peaceful at all. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something cracks open. Then he said he needed to call me back, and he hung up before I could respond. I sat at Priya's kitchen table, coffee going cold with phone face up on the table, and waited. Priya didn't ask a single question. She just set a plate of toast in front of me, and sat across from me with a paperback, like it was any regular Tuesday morning. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank her for that. The call came back, almost 40 minutes later. It wasn't my father. It was my mother, and she was crying, not her usual composed, managed tears, but something raw and a little bit terrifying. She told me that after my father hung up with me, he'd gone straight to Grant's room, to tell him I hadn't sent anything anywhere. And instead of looking relieved, Grant had looked worse, because my father, for maybe the first time in years, had looked his son directly in the eye, and asked him what exactly he'd been so afraid I would send. And Grant, alone in a room with a father who wasn't nodding along and smoothing things over anymore, couldn't hold his story together. What came out, in pieces, was this. Grant hadn't lost that promotion, because of anything I'd said at a cookout. He'd lost it, because 2 of his junior coworkers had filed a formal complaint against him, accusing him of taking credit for their work on multiple projects, and creating a hostile environment in the process. HR had records. There was a whole paper trail. Rather than face any of that at home, Grant had built an entirely different version of events, one where my one honest sentence to Derek had somehow derailed his entire career. And my parents, who had spent decades finding it easier to believe whatever version of the story Grant told them, had swallowed it completely. They'd used that lie to threaten my education and sit across from me at that table, with the full weight of parental authority, behind something that wasn't even true. My mother told me all of this, with her voice breaking every few words. She said she hadn't known. I believed her, and I also understood that not knowing had taken a fair amount of effort on her part over the years. She said my father was downstairs, not speaking to anyone. She said Grant had shut himself in his room. She said the whole house felt different, like something had shifted permanently. I didn't offer much comfort, because I honestly didn't have much to give in that moment. What I did say was that I needed time and that I wasn't ready to come back, and that I wasn't even sure home was the right word for that house anymore. I told her that what happened at that table wasn't a misunderstanding. My education had been used as leverage, my future made conditional on my silence, and even if every word Grant said had been true, that still would have been wrong. Now that it was clear none of it was true, I needed space to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I still wanted with people who'd been so quick to believe the worst about me. She said she understood. I think, for once, she actually meant it. The weeks after that were hard, in the plain, unglamorous way real life is hard. I applied for emergency aid, and got a partial grant that covered most of what was left of my tuition. My shifts at the clinic picked up. Priya refused to take a cent of rent, and told me I could pay her back one day, with a nice dinner, once I was a working nurse. I studied harder than I ever had in my life, not to prove anything to my parents or my brother, but to the version of myself, who had almost let one dinner conversation define the rest of her life. My father called me about 2 weeks later. Not to explain himself, not to defend what happened, just to say he'd been wrong, that he'd let years of favoring Grant blind him to what was fair, and that he was sorry. It was the most honest apology he'd ever given me. It didn't undo anything, but it was real, and I held on to it. Grant and I haven't spoken since that night. Maybe that changes someday. Maybe it doesn't. I've stopped trying to plan out in advance what forgiveness is supposed to look like, or how fast it's supposed to arrive. What I do know is that I'm 3 weeks away from finishing my degree. I have my own apartment now. I wake up in the morning without that tight, familiar dread sitting in my chest. And that little cedar box I carried out of my parents' house in the dark, the one with my savings bonds and my grandmother's thimble, still sits on my desk every single day, reminding me that even at 4 a.m. in that driveway, I knew exactly who I was. That's the one thing nobody in that family ever got to take from me. If any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever been the one asked to shrink yourself so somebody else could feel bigger, then you already understand why I needed to tell this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's more where this came from.